which by the end of the next Parliament would amount to £32 billion a year. We do that by radically cutting the foreign aid budget. We do it by ending EU contributions, which are wholly unnecessary to us doing trade. We do it by scrapping vanity projects such as HS2. And we do it by revisiting the Barnett formula, despite the fact the other three parties are sworn to maintain it. We do it by revisiting and changing the Barnett formula to give Wales and England a better and fairer deal.
Well, Mr. Clegg has been speaking to our political editor, Faisal Islam.
We were very clear in our last manifesto, clearer than any other party, as we are this time, about what the spending reductions and tax increases would be needed to balance the books. I remember actually at the time being criticised for being too explicit about the difficult decisions that need to be taken. In fact, what we then did in government was precisely what we'd said before, which was, yes, balance the books, because you need to do that. There's nothing fair about saddling our children and our grandchildren with this generation's debts, but we did it in a much more balanced and fairer way than the Conservatives ever would have done on their own.
So you're saying the Conservatives have no heart and Labour have no brain?
Because we will provide the heart and we'll provide the brain.
Do you feel, though, that, I mean, in this document you're making big claims about education spending, for example. Are these claims really going to cut through? A couple of billion extra here?
It's £2.5 billion more than the Labour Party are planning and £5 billion more than the Conservatives are planning every single year. That is a huge, huge difference. Look, firstly, you know, look at what we actually did during this coalition government. I personally intervened at the beginning of the last government when the Conservatives wanted to do what they want to do now, which is cut the real terms budget for nurseries and schools and colleges, and I insisted that the budget for schools for children from the age of 4 to 16 was protected. What we're now saying is that we want to go further and make sure that the money for nurseries and for schools and for colleges are properly protected, even as the number of youngsters going into the education system increase. Now, we did it before, we can do it again. In fact, what we did, of course, in this last government was we particularly put more money, £2.5 billion more money, into the education of the most disadvantaged children because of our front page manifesto commitment in 2010 to the pupil premium, and this front page manifesto commitment to protect spending for cradle to college, if I can put it that way, is something that we will be as determined to deliver again.
You say the era of single-party government's over, you welcome the multi-party arrangements, as long as that party's you. What's wrong with the SNP if they get 30 or 40 seats?
I don't think having the SNP in government or pulling the strings, which appears to be the sort of secret plan for the Labour Party, I don't think having them pulling the strings in the governance of a country when they want to pull the country apart is acceptable to many people.
Is it acceptable to you?
No, it's not. In the same way that I wouldn't put Nigel Farage in charge of Europe, I wouldn't. Why? Of course, we wouldn't put the SNP in charge of a country which they want to pull to bits.
If the Scottish people choose it, are you saying that that is somehow illegitimate?
How can a party legitimately govern a whole nation, the United Kingdom, if they want to pull that nation apart? The SNP might have a very strong voice in Scotland, and we'll let the people of Scotland decide in the ballot box on May the 7th. We're talking about the government of our whole nation. And I don't think having a sort of factionalist government where part of the government, directly or indirectly, is run by a party that actually wants to pull the United Kingdom apart is right, in the same way, by the way, that I'd never put Nigel Farage, who wants to pull the European Union apart, in charge of Europe. But equally, I think having the Conservatives in hock and dancing to the tune of Nigel Farage and the right wing of the Conservative Party is good for our country either. Of course, as leader of the Liberal Democrats, I think the only way we're going to make sure that we have strength and stability and fairness in the next Parliament is by having Liberal Democrats back in government.
So you're ruling out a multi-party deal with either UKIP, which you've done before, or the SNP?
Yes.
Ruled out?
Yes.
George Osborne seems to have outsourced a disproportionate amount of blame for the unpopular stuff this government has done to you, and you don't seem to have taken much of the credit for the recovery. Isn't that a massive political failure on your part, on behalf of your party, which is in dire straits in terms of the National? Well,
I don't think we are in nearly as much in dire straits as you imply, of course, but let the people decide on May the 7th, and then we can argue the toss. Look, there just seems to be a reality. If you look at the coalition governments across Europe, it does seem to be a pattern that the smaller parties get a disproportionate share of the blame for the bad stuff and don't get a proportionate share of the credit for the good stuff. And that is why, of course, the Liberal Democrats, we need to argue our case. We need to get out on doorsteps and say that if it wasn't for the Liberal Democrats, we wouldn't have more apprenticeships than before, we wouldn't have fairer pensions, we wouldn't have huge tax cuts for people on middle and low incomes, we wouldn't have shared parental leave, we wouldn't have better childcare, we wouldn't have healthy meals at lunchtime for little toddlers. Of course we need to tell our side of the story because nobody's going to do it for us. But that doesn't mean it's not a good story. That doesn't mean I'm not incredibly proud of what we've achieved. It doesn't mean that I don't think it's any less of a brave decision 5 years ago to have stepped up to the plate and helped pull the country back from the economic brink, which of course is where the Labour Party, the last Labour government, had left our economy.
Just lastly, assuming you get re-elected in Sheffield, if it was a deal breaker in any deal after the election, would you be willing to stand aside as leader?
No other party can determine who leads the Liberal Democrats. It's only Liberal Democrats who can do that.
Well, Faisal is with us now.